Our next presenter is Mary Rice Hasson. She is the Kate O'Byrne Fellow in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She also directs the Catholic Women's Forum, a network of Catholic professional women and scholars seeking to amplify the voice of Catholic women in support of human dignity, authentic freedom, and Catholic social teaching. Mary's an expert on topics related to women, faith, culture, family, sexual morality, and gender ideology. Different than gender identity, by the way. She has been a keynote speaker for the Holy See during the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women for the last 3 years. She is a consultant to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. She speaks frequently at national, regional, and diocesan conferences and conducts workshops for Catholic parishes and dioceses on sexuality, gender identity, and pastoral care. Mary's writing has appeared in a variety of websites, policy journals, and scholarly publications as well. She's been interviewed by a wide range of national media and is a frequent commenter on EWTN and Catholic Radio. Please give a warm welcome to Mary Rice Hasson.
Well, it is wonderful to be here today, and I want to start out by simply saying thank you. My father and mother were both involved in pro-life work from the time I was a child, and my dad used to come and go to different places and speak around the country. And he used to come back home and tell us that the real heroes of the pro-life movement were people like those who are filling this room, the people who do the hard work and are not standing on a podium, but who make the difference in bringing the message of life to many people who have not heard it. So thank you. Thank you for all that you do. I'm going to be talking about a topic that you may be thinking, why is this at the Cleveland Right to Life conference? Well, what does it have to do with life? We're used to thinking of the vulnerable, right? The unborn, children, people with disabilities, the elderly, and then you throw into this whole idea of people expressing a different gender identity. What does that have to do with defending the right to life? Well, my dad, in 1969, my dad was Charlie Rice. He was a law professor at Notre Dame and did a lot of pro-life work. And he wrote a book in 1969 that was called The Vanishing Right to Live. And in that book, he identified 8 different issues that he said were indicative of the culture's slide, the culture's growing disrespect for life, the increase or the refusal of people to take moral responsibility for their actions. And I was looking at his list and thinking, that was before Roe v. Wade. That was before the New York abortion law that he worked on. And yet, he could see the interrelationship of all these issues. And so, if he were here today, he passed away 6 years ago, I know gender ideology would be on his list. It would be something that we have to pay attention to as people who care deeply about the value of human life. So let me explain. First, what's gender ideology? What does this phrase mean? What are we talking about? Well, let me give you some basics. First, think about the human person. We're used to talking about the person in terms of personhood and unborn life. But step back a second and realize that understanding who we are as a person, understanding the value of human life, makes it possible to answer all those other questions in life. It's only when you know who you are that you can decide and know what the meaning of life is, what my purpose in life is, how I should act, how I can help others to act in a way that is in accord with their nature, that respects their true dignity as a human being. You have to know who you are. Every adolescent goes through a time where they're sort of figuring out who they are. And when I was growing up, it was kind of easy in a sense, because the task in front of me was to figure out how I was alike or different from my siblings, from my parents, what my interests were. But I knew I was female. I knew I was going to grow up and be a woman. I wanted to be a mom. I knew that. I didn't have to wake up every morning and wrestle with what my identity is. Am I really female, or am I maybe a boy because I like certain things or whatever? The tasks in front of our young people today are much more complicated because they're being given an erroneous vision of who they are. First, let me just had to back up there a second. For thousands of years, we have known who we are. We've had a broad consensus, even among those who don't share our faith. We knew we were creatures from the first moment of our existence in relationship with a God who made us, that that's the foundation of our dignity. We didn't have to earn it. We didn't need a law to say it. Our dignity comes from being human beings made in the image and likeness of God. We know, too, we're made male and female, and that our bodies are made one for another, male for female. And that when male and female come together, you have children, and that's the foundation of the family. We know, too, that life is a gift, and that we're called not just to life here, but to eternal life. This is who we are. Our fundamental identity is as sons and daughters of the Lord. This is who we are. But what does the culture say? Today's culture gives a very different message. You may have seen these images before, this little genderbread person. And in fact, during the Obama administration, the genderbread person, that image, was used by USAID to explain to all those less developed countries that really had old-fashioned ideas about what it meant to be a human being, that this is who we are. And this image is not of a person who's a unity of body and soul, but rather of a fractured, fragmented individual, a jumble of all these different dimensions, none of which needs to align, each of which exists on a spectrum. And I want to call your attention to three aspects that are on the image here. Two that have to do with sex. Sex, what is sex? Biology tells us what sex is. It's our whole body organization towards a reproductive role. There are only two sexes, no matter what you hear out there, because there are only two gametes, large gametes, small gametes. People who have large gametes are female, people who have small gametes are male. When the two come together, that's how you reproduce. There is no human being on this earth who was produced or came into existence by anything other than that binary combination. Sex is binary, and it's immutable. It's in every cell of our body. But when you look at this image, what is the message here? What is the lie that's being told throughout our culture now? It's that we're divided, and we have an anatomical sex, which just means sort of our body parts. But even here, it's conceptualized as maleness and femaleness, because they don't want to say the truth, that we're created male and female. You look at the other label there, sex assigned at birth. Some of you may have heard that. Maybe you've even used that phrase. And I would encourage you not to use that phrase, because we are male or female. Sex is not a label that's bureaucratically assigned. In fact, in some of the children's books that are now created to explain gender and sex to children, the narrative goes something like this. When you were born, the doctor looked at your body and took a guess. The doctor made a guess as to who you are, but only you know for sure. So this idea of sex assigned at birth is a false idea. It's as if the doctor slaps a label on the child's rear end when they're born, male or female, and when they're old enough, they can peel it off and decide who they want to be. It's just not true. But that's part of the falsehood here about who we are. There's another phrase here on that same slide, gender identity. And here you've probably heard a lot about it because many cities and now the federal government are trying to put gender identity into law. The Supreme Court decision last year, it was called Bostock decision, interpreted sex to include gender identity. Well, what's gender identity? Gender identity is defined as your feeling of who you are. Male, female, man, woman, both, neither, something else. It's your self-perception. How is a child supposed to figure out their gender identity? By looking at stereotypes. By thinking, am I the type of person who likes pink? I must be a girl. Am I the type of person who's comfortable playing hockey out in the street? Well, maybe I'm a boy. So it tells children that who they are, the most fundamental thing about who they are, their identity, is something that's in flux and that depends on their feelings. And even more so, it's amorphous. It's defined by these ever-changing ideas of stereotypes. You cannot measure gender identity. You can't test for it. You can't do an X-ray. Can't do a blood test. It's completely subjective, self-perceived. And the other thing is, you don't know what someone's gender identity is unless you ask. I was on a college campus a number of years ago on National Coming Out Day. No, I was not coming out. But there were kids walking around with these t-shirts that said, no assumptions, no judgments. And I asked a young person who looked male to me, but I wasn't going to assume. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, the idea is you have to respect everyone's gender identity. You don't know who they are until they disclose it. Don't make any assumptions. So you could see someone who looks completely male, who is male, and you cannot assume that that's their identity. So that's the idea of gender identity, which is now, as I said, being embedded in law, in municipalities, in states, in federal law, by executive order under the Biden administration, and most troublingly, in the pending Equality Act, which has been passed by the House, and there's a Senate hearing next week on that. And we'll see what happens. The net result is this. Gender ideology tells people that who they are is whoever they define themselves to be. They're completely autonomous. And there's no limit to the labels, there's no limit to the identities. That's who you are. Think back to that slide where I put up Christian anthropology. Think of that difference. One of the things that is unfortunate is that even within our Christian communities, people do not realize how inherently contradictory gender ideology is in terms of Christian anthropology, the vision of who we are. So, gender ideology, that's what it is. What's it doing to our culture? Why should we be concerned? Well, it's doing a lot. First, realize its roots. This is, even though I've heard many people say that after the same-sex marriage decision in 2015, that all of a sudden transgender became the big issue. And they said, where did that come from? Well, it comes from philosophies that have had an influence for nearly 100 years, but increasingly since the sexual revolution. It's heavily influenced by Marxist feminism. I'm not talking about opportunity feminism, the idea that women should be able to get an education, have opportunities to be part of civic life and all that, but radical Marxist feminism that views the family as something to be taken down, as a source of oppression, as a tool of capitalism, and views the body as something that's also oppressive. In fact, there's a feminist writer, Shulamith Firestone, who wrote a book called The Dialectic of Sex. And in it, she said, she envisioned, and this was 1970, envisioned the day when women could be liberated from carrying children. And in her utopian vision, maybe males would take that on, but ideally it would be completely outsourced. Think of where we are. She was envisioning that on the basis of ideology in 1970. There were no techniques to make that possible like there are today. So we see these influences: Marxist feminism, nihilism, atheism, all of these things. And then a lot of this came up in the 1950s. The word gender was first applied to human beings. We're familiar with gender in language if you've ever studied a foreign language, right? In the 1950s, a doctor named Dr. John Money, who was a psychologist, and he described himself as a sexologist. And he worked with a troubled population that was known as transsexuals. It was a very tiny sliver of the population, usually adult men who expressed this vehement dislike of their body and a desire to be women. So he worked with them, and he also worked to some degree with children who were born with what we now call intersex disorders. In other words, when they were conceived, when they were in utero, something went wrong in the development of their sexual development. So when they're born, they're not a third sex. It's just sometimes difficult to tell. There can be a chromosomal abnormality, a hormonal abnormality, sometimes a genital abnormality. But that's not a different sex. That's a disorder of sexual development, just like you can have a disorder of heart development or any other part of your body. So this Dr. Money in the 1950s, because he was used to working with these two different populations where there was sort of a divide between how they felt and their identity and their bodies, came up with this idea that you could separate sex, biological sex, male and female, from your social role. And he called that social role gender. That idea really took off in the early 60s. The radical feminists grabbed it because, for many feminists, the idea that your future would be determined by your biology was anathema. So grabbing hold of this idea of gender as being something apart, something different, so your sex doesn't dictate your life's course, was something they ran with. Now, for most of us, when we grew up and heard the word gender, we probably thought male-female, or we thought sexual difference, because that's the usage it acquired in the general population. But in academia, these ideas were percolating and growing and becoming more radicalized. So from that early feminist scholarship, then you had gender theory, then you had queer theory, and the ideas kept getting more and more radical to the point that gender is now understood and often defined in the law, but understood in academia as just completely separate from the idea of your bodily sex. It's just your feeling, your self-perception. Or some theorists will say, it's not even that, it's just what you do. Your gender is what you do. So, first takeaway, don't use the word gender when you mean sex. If we're talking male and female, you're talking about sex, not gender, because to the rest of the world and the culture and even the law, it does not mean what we think it means. But ideas have consequences. Once you separate identity from bodily sex, and you stop paying attention to the nature of the human being, that male and female are made for one another, that children are to be born of a mother, you get what we have now, where we're seeing an explosion in not just identities, but different kinds of relationships. There was a slide, I should put it on here, or an image recently of 3 men out in California who all want to be dads for these kids who were conceived by artificial insemination and surrogacy and things like that. There's a booming business in surrogacy. It's something that should be important to people who care about life because it's dehumanizing. The child is treated like a commodity, a thing that you must have, and the woman as a breeder. And in fact, India had to shut down its surrogacy because they had so many people from the West principally a lot of people in the LGBTQ community going to India and taking advantage of these young women who were poor and who were literally housed in these breeder farms where they were exploited. They were kept there just to deliver a baby to be handed over to someone else. Ideas have consequences. So what else do we need to know? Gender ideology is not something just in Cleveland. It's not just something in Washington, D.C. This is a global phenomenon. And it's driven by the West. It's driven by the US, the Scandinavian countries, the UK. The countries that are resisting it are the African nations, parts of Asia, parts of South America. But I work with some people in the Caribbean, and I will tell you, some of you may remember Pope Francis talking about this idea of ideological colonization. And that's what's happening to these countries. Many of these countries are mostly Christian or mostly Catholic, and yet they're very poor. And the UN comes in and they say, your laws refuse to recognize same-sex marriage. They don't recognize gender identity. If you want the aid that we have to give, so you can have money, medicine, food, better roads, you need to change your laws. And that is going on, and it is going to accelerate. We saw it under the Obama administration. There was a little bit of a pause during the Trump administration, not as much as I would have liked, but it is going to just take off again. The Biden administration has already made that known. What else do we need to know? It's well-funded, of course, right? God's got plenty of money, but I think he wants our effort. He wants our prayers, because it always seems like the other side has way more money. But if you look at these are figures from 2018 from people within the LGBT community who track the funds being spent. So within the US, $209 million spent just in the US to promote the LGBT agenda. And of that, almost 29 million just to promote the transgender agenda. And we're not talking about healthcare. We're talking about advocacy, education, things that are going to change laws, hearts, and minds. So this is a well-funded effort. But if you look at I don't know if you can see clearly enough, all those balls, those are the key foundation funders. There's a lot of money coming from individuals, from governments, from other things, but this just represents foundation money. The biggest foundation source here is from a pharmaceutical company. Consider why. Because part of the whole transgender agenda is that when you convince people that they can feminize or masculinize their body in ways that are not natural, you have created a customer for life. There is a lot of money in this business, just like with Planned Parenthood. And in fact, this is a list of the top 10 grant recipients in 2018. These numbers are higher now, but you'll notice number 9, Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is on the dole for funds. It's into the whole transgender business in a big way, both in terms of numbers and in the money being spent. Why? Partly because their abortion business has declined, especially with the Trump administration curtailing some of the federal funds that went there. They need to make money. So again, we see that tie. If you disregard the value of human beings, of human life, it's not going to trouble you to take a troubled 18-year-old girl who walks in and says, I'm confused, I think I'm male, and write her a script for testosterone and send her on her way. You don't do that if you care about people. But again, we know who Planned Parenthood is. Another aspect of this is that gender ideology has politicized psychology. I cannot tell you how many calls I've gotten from families who have a troubled adolescent or college student who's just suffering because they're confused about their identity, and they go to talk to a psychiatrist or to a psychologist. And sure enough, the answer is, the reason why you're unhappy is because you need to embrace your authentic self and be transgender. There's a lot of pressure on these counselors, particularly now that about 20 states have conversion therapy bans, which make it very risky for counselors to be open about the fact that they think it's healthier when someone's feelings are not aligned with their body. It's healthier to help the person align their feelings, to figure out what's underneath. Why is it, for example, that an adolescent girl would hate her body so much? What's going on there? That's not a normal thing to experience. Many of these kids who are experiencing these troubles have trauma in their background, sexual abuse. There's a high percentage who have autism. They feel like they don't fit in quite with their peers, and they're looking for an explanation, and it's given to them. A lot of children with mental health issues, pre-existing mental health issues, are very vulnerable to being sucked into this. So on a broad scale, what we've seen is that within the culture, all our major institutions have been captured by this gender ideology, from business to medicine to media to education, and now even the foster care and child welfare wing of things, municipalities. What you see here is some of the fruit of the work of the Human Rights Campaign, which 20 years ago decided they were going to set the benchmarks for equality, measuring equality in terms of how people who are same-sex attracted were treated in business. But in the course of 20 years, what they've done is ratchet up what they're demanding of companies. So they went to the Fortune 500 companies and they said, we're going to measure you. We're going to assess whether you are friendly to equality. And then we're going to publish that. And you either get a high score or we'll know you're a bigot. And of course, the companies have really gotten on board. Most of the Fortune 500 companies now play along and freely are evaluated, but they adjust their human resources policies in order to win that coveted 100% corporate equality, best place to work criteria. But as I said, over 20 years, that criteria has ratcheted up. So now, in order to get top marks as a company, you not only have to have human resources policies like benefits and things like that for people, no matter how they identify. You have to cover transgender surgeries. You have to use your corporate philanthropy dollars to support the agenda. You have to hire subcontractors who support the agenda. And if you don't, they take points off. And they added something recently that says they want to see something pro-social, like are you filing an amicus brief in favor of changing laws to recognize gender identity and sexual orientation? And they've replicated this model, again, not just in businesses, but in cities, healthcare, schools, et cetera. So this is why, in case you feel like everyone's sort of not on the same side as we are, it's because on an institutional level, the other side has really captured the policymaking. That doesn't mean that we've lost, but it helps to understand what you're up against. This is not accidental. So culturally, you're all familiar with just different things. The whole, that picture on the top middle is just sort of funny. It's the big guy is a guy who identifies as female and wants to compete against women in biking, as if anyone's going to mistake him for a female. But we see all these things, from the all-gender restrooms to children's books promoting LGBT stuff to the controversies over athletics. That's the culture we're living in. More importantly, that's the culture that's being streamed into our kids' phones 24/7. Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram. They're not just places where people post information. All of those places put storylines out there. They're sending kids these messages. It is just cultural saturation, to the point that our assumptions have flipped. This was a story that was publicized a week or two ago about this actor who said this child who he has by surrogacy. He was boasting about how he was going to do everything he could to raise this child to be gay. Imagine if you had some celebrity who said, I'm going to do everything to make sure my kid is straight. He would be called a bigot, but the assumptions have flipped, that this is a healthy way to be. This is conducive to human flourishing. One of the consequences, just as we saw in the abortion debate, is the corruption of language. I'm old enough to remember when people really did use the clump of cells argument. Sonograms kind of broke through that. It's hard to argue it's a clump of cells when you can see a smile. But we're seeing that same corruption of language. As you talk about choice, it's about equality on the basis of gender identity. But even the mere meaning of words, we've become used to hearing things like the transgender man who gave birth. Stop. Men don't give birth. Anyone who gives birth is a female. That's a female who identifies as a man, who may be taking hormones so that now she has a beard and she's got pattern baldness and acne, and she may have had surgery to create a fake appendage. But she's a female. She's a female. Only females give birth. And yet this is what we're hearing and what we're used to. The bottom picture of the two faces there just kind of breaks my heart every time I think about it. It's a story of a family who the son decided he was really female, so he transitioned with the support of his family. And then the mom decided that she needed to express her gender identity and she was really male. So the child, in trying to make sense of this, would say to his friends and people, I have a mom and a dad in the same body. It doesn't make sense. It used to be that adults would make sense of the world for children. And yet now the world that our children are living in is unexplainable, it's unintelligible. In fact, there's a line from Vatican II. It talks about man becoming unintelligible to himself when he loses sight of Christ. That it is through Jesus Christ that we know who we are, that we understand who we are. So as the darkness falls in terms of faith and belief, and the culture loses sight of the reality that we're creatures of God, the confusion sets in. This corruption of language is now also corruption of science. So again, one of the things that's so troubling with abortion is that doctors know better, right? They know this is a living human being. How can they do that? We're seeing the same thing in what's now called gender medicine, where science is being erased. So this is actually a part of a curriculum, well, not a curriculum, a policy that's being promoted in public schools. And it's not a curriculum because curricula usually has to be approved by a school board. A policy overlay does not. You just educate the teachers and they bring it into the classroom. And what's happening here, when you look at this language, this is right from their book, you're talking about male-female puberty, but erasing males and females, as if it's just bodies and parts, and these parts do these things. So if you're a body that has those parts, your body might do these things. It's unintelligible. It's poor science. It doesn't make sense. But because ideology is so controlling, this is what's being fed to our children. And again, we see it promoted in the children's books. Scholastic books, I grew up with them. They were at book fairs in my Catholic school. They have a whole section now on how to explain and introduce gender identity to children. You go to Barnes & Noble, you will find books like these. And again, the public schools, I wrote a book 2 years ago with my sister. It's called Get Out Now, Why You Should Pull Your Child from Public School Before It's Too Late. And we wrote it because as we were both working on these issues, and we saw what was happening to the public schools. And there are many good people in the public schools, both as teachers, administrators, families, the children who go there, but they're not calling the shots. The unions have bought into this. The state education organizations, the school counselors, school psychologists, they've bought into it. So this is being pushed top down. It came in through anti-bullying programs. No one wants bullying. No matter what struggles a kid is having, Nobody wants anyone to be bullied, but we can solve a bullying problem without having to teach everyone, every child, that their identity is not fixed, that there is no male and female, that there's a whole new vocabulary, and yes, they should explore their gender. And worse, the schools will not tell you if your child decides in school that they want to transition. Transition takes several steps. The first is what's called a social transition. Child starts wearing either androgynous clothes or the clothes of the opposite sex. They might grow their hair or cut their hair, change their name. They want different pronouns. It's a psychological transition. But what's happening in our public schools, and this is a form from Montgomery County Schools, right near where I am in Washington, D.C., and if a child expresses to a teacher, an aide, a counselor, the librarian, to anyone, that they're confused about their identity, or they think they are a different identity, the school sits down with the child and says, among other things, would your parents support that? And if the child says no, the schools will not tell you. They will not pick up the phone and say, did you know that when you drop Johnny off at school, he goes into the restroom and he puts on makeup and all? Did you know that was happening? They will not tell you unless your child consents. And I talked with the administrator at Montgomery County who was in charge of this. I said, and I told her who I was and I worked on these issues. She did not Google me. So I got a lot of information from her because she assumed I was working on the other side. And I said, well, you know, do you ever run into problems with parents being upset that 9 months down the road, when their kid all of a sudden asks for testosterone, they want to go to the next step, the parents are blown away. They're like, what? What's going on? And she said, oh yeah, I had a mom come in who was so angry, and she walked in and she said, how dare you? And I just sent her to the lawyers because we're here for the children. And that's the problem, that there are certain people within the school system who truly believe that parents cannot be trusted to do what is best for their children. And that's why they will not tell you, especially if you're conservative or religious, they will not tell you that your child has identity issues. And we can see the results. There was a Gallup poll that came out recently that showed that of the college-age generation, about 16% of those kids, 1 in 6, now identifies as LGBTQ. That has not happened in all of history. Okay, in all of history, it's consistently 1 to 2%. 16%. That's because they're being taught it. And it's now kind of the cool thing. I've talked to a lot of middle school teachers who say, it's the cool thing, especially if you're a kid in middle school who's not very cool. You get a lot of attention and a lot of instant affirmation and a lot of special things happening to support you if you identify as LGBTQ. Of that figure, about 2% identifies as transgender, but when we look at stats from high schools, it's 2 to 3% as of a few years ago, but we also see clusters. So in some school districts or classrooms, you will have 10%, 12%, even 20% identifying as transgender or genderqueer. In other words, they're rejecting their body. They may not have figured out what identity they want, but they know they're rejecting their sexed body. So this is having an impact in a remarkably short amount of time. It's changing even how people of faith think about this. So these stats, thankfully, are any evangelicals in here? My hat's off to you. Evangelicals are holding much more firmly to the truth about who we are, that we're created male and female. So more than 3/4 of evangelicals will say, nope, if you're born male or female, can't change. Only about half of Catholics have that conviction. Half of our Catholic brethren are confused about that. And I will tell you, for certain, sex cannot change. Because even when you look at the informed consent documents in these gender clinics, that's when they get down to brass tacks. They're not promising kids that they can change sex. They specifically say that these hormones will masculinize or feminize your body. That's all. And it's going to have all these deleterious effects. But there's no promise you can ever be the opposite sex. But these young people embrace this idea that somehow, if they're feeling miserable, somehow this is the ticket to a better life, to solving their problems. Why? Because all the adults and trusted people around them are assuring them, yep, things will be much better. You just have to embrace your authentic self, transition, and all's good. And all is not good, which we'll talk about in a minute. But one of the other cultural things that we're experiencing too is a new wave of hostility. Austin touched on that to some extent. But just hostility. Why? Because it is people of faith who have the courage to speak the truth. Not exclusively. I work with a lot of radical feminists. There's some atheist biologists who think this is just crazy. In other words, they believe in the reality of sex, and so they're opposing the transgender agenda because of that. But by and large, it's people of faith who say, this is a lie, and I can't go along with a lie. Just as with abortion, when you lose sight of the truth about the person, children become the sacrificial victim. And that's what we're seeing here. This is there are a lot of these celebrity kids who, this particular little boy, when he was 4 years old, told his parents he was a girl. Inside, he was a girl. And the parents went with that. And I'm thinking, if I went with every idea that my kids had, I have 7 kids, by the way. The youngest is 19. But you don't take a 4-year-old's word for something that, first of all, they're just plain wrong. He cannot be a girl. But again, instead of adults making sense of the world, it's this idea that feelings are all that matter. So he became this celebrity kid, although it was interesting. He was featured in a documentary on HBO called Transhood a few months ago. And he was complaining to his mom that she was making him go to more activist events. You know, these kids, especially the young ones, oftentimes become vehicles for parents who either wanted a child of the opposite sex or are very progressive and sort of find it an amazingly wonderful thing that they get to celebrate their kids' trans identity. Adolescence, it's a little bit different. This image, I oftentimes will tell a little bit more about them, but let me just sum up here for the sake of time, that in the course of my work, I meet so many people who are affected by this. We hear all the happy talk that, you know, the rainbows and celebrate this, and this is the way to human flourishing. If we would all just stop stigmatizing and we'd all just affirm people's feelings and their innermost identity, it's just not true, either for the persons themselves or for those who love them. That the heartbreak of parents when they see a daughter, for example, perfectly fine through high school, goes off to college, falls in with a different crowd, comes home, tells her parents they need to support her decision to take testosterone or they're out of her life. And then they see within a year's time photos that she's posted of herself after having undergone a double mastectomy and is living what she thinks is going to be the route to, you know, happiness and fulfillment. There's so much heartbreak around this. And so we have to talk about it, just like with abortion. You know, remember people, we had the abortion pro-life activists, but what we were missing was what became a very compelling piece. People who had experienced the heartbreak of abortion, whether as grandparents or the mother or the father of the child, coming forward and saying, no, that was a mistake. That was wrong. And I deeply regret it. We need to be able to talk about this so the people who are going through it know that they will experience that love and compassion from us. And yet that we will speak the truth just as we would to someone who's contemplating an abortion. We don't support by saying whatever you choose is fine. We say, you know, you will be a great mom and I will be right here with you because your child is already connected to you, loving you, needs you, but let me help. In the same way, these families that are struggling with these issues. So again, I already went over the science. One of the things that I think pulls kids into this is they get confused because this whole focus on stereotypes. This is a graph that shows, just naturally speaking, there's a significant overlap of things that are considered masculine traits or feminine traits. So instead of saying to children that, no, maybe your personality is more quiet, that doesn't mean you're really a girl because the girls like to play quietly in your little preschool. No, you are who you are. We need to make room for people to express themselves in terms of personalities. But what kids are being taught is these personality traits mean they're fundamentally someone different. And it's interesting, this is the diagnostic criteria in the DSM for how you diagnose gender dysphoria in a child. And if you look at what's there, it's feelings, dislike, preference, desire. And then it's stereotypes for the toys of the opposite sex, for friends of the opposite sex. This is a DSM criteria. I think of my two daughters who were complete tomboys, as we used to say. Someone could have diagnosed them in an instant. They didn't want to wear dresses, and they wanted to be with their brothers. I have 5 boys. But today, it becomes a pathology with a medical solution. And so the standard of care, as I said, is this gender-affirming approach that says, if a child says, this is who I am, you can only affirm. That's the only thing. Instead of asking the question, why? If you feel like it's a terrible thing to be male or female, why? What's underneath? Why? What has gone on in your life that you hate your body? There's a wound there to be explored and healed. You can't heal it when you just affirm sort of the desire to fix it in this way. So we've seen a great spike in the number, particularly of adolescents and adolescent girls. It's 2 to 1 girls who are being drawn into this, just off the charts. And we've seen an explosion in gender clinics. There's money to be made. In 2007, there was 1 gender clinic. Now there are over 65 for children. There are many more that do adults, but for children. And in fact, there's one in Cincinnati, which is just, there was a lawsuit some of you may be familiar with, but I remember in the course of that lawsuit, the director was asked by the judge, is there any child who comes in experiencing these identity problems who you send away and say, no, you're not transgender? And the woman who directed said, no. You go there, they're just going to put you on the path. And social media emphasizes the same thing. There are plenty of quizzes out there. Adolescents love to take quizzes. Am I transgender? Guaranteed the answer is going to be yes. Same thing with the YouTube videos of all these kids who get confused and start going down this road. And they memorialize it. And it's all happy talk until it's not. So the stages, transition is social, but then puberty blockers, which a lot of people used to say in the beginning that puberty blockers were just a pause. It just stops the child's development so they can figure out who they are. And now there's good evidence that no, it's not a pause. And in fact, when you put a child on puberty blockers, 97 in one study, 100% of those kids go on to cross-sex hormones. Whereas in the past, if you did nothing, or if you did family therapy, the vast majority of those kids, 80, 85%, would resolve those feelings. So instead, we're creating a problem by putting them on this pathway. And then after the puberty blockers, kids mid-teens, it's cross-sex hormones. Now here's the problem. You put a child on puberty blockers, you're arresting their development. That means they never develop sexually. Then you give that same child cross-sex hormones. That child is sterilized. So we have children who are 14, 15, 16 who've gone from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones. They will never be fertile. So Why isn't that a tremendous scandal? That we're sterilizing children because they have confused feelings. And then, of course, there's the surgeries. Top surgery, bottom surgery is what they call genital surgery. And you will hear in these debates about transgender issues, nobody does surgery on kids. Not true. And here's the proof. This is an NIH observational study that was done by 4 different gender centers, and they reported their data. And this is showing that they did at least 2 mastectomies, double mastectomies, on girls who were 13. Okay, and we have National Geographic footage of a young man who was 17 undergoing genital surgery. And there's a study that talks about the number of physicians that are willing to do that. It's not true that surgery doesn't happen on kids. It absolutely does, with all sorts of complications. But let me move ahead to something. One of the big pressure points for families around this issue is the fear that if they don't go along with their child's going to commit suicide. And that's a narrative. When you talk to people who are detransitioners, people who went through this, transitioned, still were unhappy, they finally got real therapy, and they realized, I'm not trans, and so they detransition. When you talk to them, you will hear that there are all sorts of scripts out there. The kids know what it takes to get hormones. A threat of suicide, you get to the gender clinic. That's what they learn on social media, on YouTube. It's part of the script. That doesn't mean every kid who says that is faking. I'm not saying that at all, because the vast majority of kids who are struggling with these issues have other real issues: depression, anxiety, autism, sexual abuse, trauma. They need healing. But when you take out the transgender factor, they still have those same high rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And transition does not solve the problem, because we have studies that show that when you look in the long term, when someone first transitions, they may feel better because they've got what they want. It doesn't last. Particularly about 6 years, 10 years, you see the suicide rates go back up. Why? Because you have not solved the problem, and instead you have helped someone commit to being at war with their body for the rest of their lives. It's not a happy place to be, and no amount of a welcoming and inclusive community can compensate for that. There's a book out there, if you're interested in this topic, I'd advise you to read. It's called Irreversible Damage, written by a Wall Street Journal reporter who talked to families, particularly of adolescent girls who were caught up in this. Lots of good information, particularly talking about people who were vulnerable. As you know, a number of the states, I checked to see if Ohio was doing this. There was some action last year, but I didn't see anything this year. A lot of states are pushing back, trying to criminalize this kind of experimental medicine on children. It's not medicine. It's child abuse. The physicians I talk to who are working on our side of the issue call it child abuse, nothing short of it. And yet the pushback to even trying to get laws that don't say you can't do this when you're 18, they just say you can't do it when you're under 18, the pushback is tremendous. So, and again, I mentioned the detransitioners, just some powerful testimonies coming out. But here's the thing to take away. To realize gender ideology is tremendously important. This is sort of the battle. It's not like abortion isn't, but it's contempt for the human person as God made it. And you cannot, even though there are many good Christians who sort of get sucked into this, you cannot truly be a Christian and embrace gender ideology, because it is completely incompatible with the understanding of the human person, the vision of the person as a Christian. Let me give you just a final thought, just some ways to think about some of the parallels that I see in terms of gender ideology and the abortion arguments. A lot of the same arguments come up. So science denying. Science is on our side. We don't hold these positions just because of faith. Our faith may illuminate that. But the reality of who we are, the science of who we are, is why we say you're male and female. We know it doesn't change. This is not a healthy thing. Just like we know the unborn is a human life. Science is on our side. But we hear, again, both in the abortion debate and gender ideology, this idea that my feelings are how we decide what the law should be, what I should be allowed to do, instead of an objective sense of what's true and what's good for the human being. Arguments from autonomy, arguments that say you can't be equal unless you're allowed to pursue this trajectory. We see the same exploitation by people within the medical community, the pharmaceutical companies, as we see in the abortion debate. The very same thing is happening regarding these gender issues. And then finally, the flawed thinking that teaches our children in particular to believe that who we are is just up to us, that we don't have a human nature, that God didn't design us according to the best design there is because he's God. And it's built into us how to live and how to flourish. But instead, our children are taught they can figure out their own way and it will be just as good. And unfortunately, it's just a lie. So let me leave you with a thought here. People often say, well, what do you do? And I think the answer is to think about how Pope Francis has handled this issue. Early in his papacy, he had a young woman who lived in Spain who was identifying as male, reached out to him and said, people are being cruel to me in my parish. He invited her to come to the Vatican, visited with her, and did not reveal the conversation, but then released a statement saying to all of us, when someone is suffering like that, we accompany them, we do not abandon them. We don't accompany them off the cliff. We walk beside them, but help them find the truth. But at the same time, Pope Francis has been vehemently opposed to gender ideology, just like Pope Benedict before him, calling a spade a spade. This is about hatred for the human person, hatred for God, hatred for the family, which is why he uses such strong language here. So we need to have and hold both of those sentiments, care for the person, just as we do with someone who has been tempted to or has had an abortion or has had it touch their lives, but being vehement in our opposition to the ideology that is damaging so many lives. So have courage, speak the truth boldly, and pray without ceasing. That's how we will win the war, because my dad used to say, in fact, he wrote a book saying, we're on the winning side. Because God's the author of truth, the author of life. We're on the winning side. So thank you. I don't know, do we have any time or we're done? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bob. Oh, please.
I'm just going to take over for a minute and pretend I'm the MC for a while. I just want to say something about Mary's father. He was probably one of the best men and the most absolutely intelligent people many people had ever met. But he was also incredibly humble. When we were going through the whole issue with making it very public across America that we stood for not being opposed to what was happening with the homosexual agenda, and we officially adopted that as part of our mission statement. I had a couple of conversations with Charlie, and I called him up and told him what we were going through. And I treasure it. It's one of my treasures in my treasure box. He sent me his lecture notes from one of his lectures. And he underlined all the pieces in his lecture notes and said, here, use this, and you'll have no problem. I can tell you I did. And I used his notes, and I literally gave me strength, gave me power. And now just about every Right to Life movement in the country understands the connection between the Right to Life movement and the homosexual and the opposing homosexual and the breakdown of marriage. And it was through Charlie Rice. So God bless your father. He was a wonderful man.
Obviously, we don't have time for questions for Mary. What I will say, two things actually. Number one, what a wealth of information that was. She probably answered almost every question you put on those cards. Number two, I was snapping pictures. Did anybody else snap pictures of the screens, right, as she put that information? I want to keep that stuff, and I know you do too. Because we couldn't ask her questions today, Molly said the same thing that I'm about to tell you. She will be on our respective radio shows. So we will be able to ask her all of those questions. I'll make copies of those cards. Molly can have them. I'm going to take some of them because I would love to present her to an even larger audience than this. So thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. Okay. We are a little bit behind our clock here, so I'm going to catch up on a couple of quick items. Number one, I promised Janine I would continue to promote the survey on the website, bringingAmericaBackToLife.org. Please take the survey. Tell them what you love, what you didn't like as much, what you want more of, what you want less of. They will take that into consideration for next year's event. Please don't forget to go there. Number two, while you're on your computer or your phone or whatever, use social media to the advantage that you can. Please tweet using the hashtag #BackToLife so we can retweet you and again grow our support. Also use Instagram and Rumble at Cleveland RTL, which of course is Cleveland Right to Life. Our next presentation is going to be with Jennifer Christie. It will begin at 4 o'clock. So what we need to do now, first of all, review the contents of your folder, but do it out there. We need everybody to clear the room so that it can be cleaned and prepared for the next presentation. Please exit quickly because again, we're a little bit off of our clock right now. Thank you all so very much.